Hello everybody, my name is Mason Clay, and today I will be going to do a critical review of the shooter genre, in which I will be looking at different examples of shooter games and what designs are implemented and how. I will be discussing some examples of where a design has been implemented quite well, or where they haven't been as well as how this has helped me generate ideas for my own designs. So, why did I choose to look at shooters? Well, due to my game for this current prototype that I'm making being shooter based, it made sense to take a look at different elements within shooter games and see what ideas I could take from them to forge my own ideas and forge my own game. Not only that, there is plenty of different ideas that have either been explored or that are yet to be implemented into the shooter genre. So I'm going to start off with quite a few examples. So this is going to be a bit of a comparison. So here we have the first Call of Duty from 2003. So when this game released compared to modern day Call of Duties, the actual gameplay was very limited. So you had your basic mechanics, so such as shooting, reloading, aiming, and you'd also have very limited movement. There wouldn't be things such as sprinting in this game, which in a lot of games now are very commonplace. This is also tried to at least be very faithful to the world wars that it is based on. Whereas, while it might have had its own story, it tried to keep things as grounded as possible to still fit that World War aesthetic. Now, compare this to current modern day Call of Duties, such as Black Ops 6. So, this example, a lot of the movement has been very streamlined and updated, so now it is much quick, so now players can sprint, slide, they can do a double sprint in the most recent games, which goes even faster. You also have things such as kill streaks, which you get rewarded for by killing different players. And also over here you have a dolphin dive, which this isn't the first game to implement it in Call of Duty, but it is one that is very recently being implemented again and is still loved by a lot of players. And we also have very experimental modes within the Call of Duty franchise. So, with this example, this is specifically from Black Ops 3. However, this started in World at War, in which instead of it having you fight other players or other enemy soldiers, you go up against zombies in a round-based game mode with its own maps and with its own set of rules. And this has also gone on a huge player base in of itself that will buy the game new Call of Duties just to play the zombies. Next we have Anthem, which has a really unique idea both in terms of actual gameplay and as well as loadouts. So on the left here, what the game tried to do is try to incorporate a traditional RPG sort of loadout system where players can choose from 4 different classes. They can choose their own different abilities, different weapons, have different stats, so they can fill out certain roles. And not only that, they also had pretty advanced movement. So as you can see here, we have it so that the players can actually fly around, which added an entirely new layer to the shoot game, in which not really many games have done before. However, this idea was pretty poorly implemented. A lot of the movement and the shooting was very buggy at launch, and not only that, the game worked around the looter-based system, in which it was very hard to get certain items, so it's different upgrades for your character, which sort of turned a lot of players off. Even after they made changes to increase drop rates, there was still a lot of issues with the game as a whole. Next we have Overwatch, specifically Overwatch 2, but this also includes the first Overwatch, in which in this game they try to give every single character their own identity. So instead of having like custom loadouts that players can choose, each hero would have their own weapon, their own distinct amount of abilities, and their own role in which they can fill. Not only that, they also incorporated a sort of traditional RPG system with there being a tank, healers, and DPS, in which you would be fighting other players against you through different game modes. And whilst it wasn't the first to do it at its time, obviously you have games such as Team Fortress 2, it still did very well at launch back in 2016 with the original Overwatch. And only that, with the fact that every character is unique and has a unique appearance and unique gameplay, it made recognizing them and relating them to Overwatch very easily. And companies can even start using it as sort of like a marketing strategy, in which they also heavily monetize with things such as skins or advertisements for the game. Next we have a pretty recent one, which is Arc Raiders. So Arc Raiders is part of a subgenre called the extraction shooter, in which players will drop in with probably next to nothing in order to get more loot to build up their loadout and their stash. So in this game specifically, players will be dropped into a map in which they will be facing both AI called Arcs, in which there's plenty of different ones, as well as other players from different squads. And of course, you don't have to shoot them, but you can, and that gave a brand new layer to the gameplay, where you're thinking, do you trust other players, or do you want to be friendly with others, or do you just want to go and try and kill everybody to steal their loot? And this was further enforced by the sort of stash system they had, in which pretty much anything you brung into a game with you, you would risk losing if you ended up being eliminated. Combine that with the limited storage space, and you're constantly encouraged to keep bringing in more and more loot with more and more weapons in hopes that you'll get even more and more better loot. But you are always running the risk of losing it all to either an AI Arc or another player. And this has worked out pretty well so far. I think a lot of it, especially with like sales, the game has, as to this day, still holds a huge player base. And moving on to the last example, we have Battlefield 4. Now this game, well, this franchise in particular is most well known probably for its vehicle combat mixed with its infantry. So instead of just being an enemy soldier, you could get into a tank, you could get into a helicopter, you could get into a jet, you could get into a boat. And whilst it is very challenging, as you have to sort of blend in both vehicle and infantry combat, because obviously vehicles are, but inherently by design, are probably going to be more powerful than infantry. It does pose a new challenge to try and balance both sides, in which I think Battlefield 4 did pretty well. Not only that, Battlefield 4 so introduced a new destruction system known as Levolution. So, in the past, Battlefield games always had pretty good destruction in which you could destroy cover, destroy buildings. However, in this installment, they ended up making it so that there are big areas in the map you can destroy to actually change the map drastically. So for example here, you have it so you can destroy one of the biggest buildings on this map that will drastically change how it's played. Now, after looking at these, I also wanted to try and start thinking of some ideas for my own games within the shooter genre. So I set myself two tasks. The first idea came from the task of just having basic movement as well as shooting. And what I came up with was a physics game in which players would be stranded in space, and what they would have to do is they would have to use different objects in order to navigate the levels. So, for example, if a player ends up shooting one direction, it's going to propel them backwards. And only that, you can extend that to different items, such as fire extinguishers or other means. As well as for idea 2, I made it so that I would try and come up with an idea for a shooter game that didn't necessarily involve guns themselves. So an idea I came up with was that the player would be using props found within the level, grabbing them, and then using them as projectiles. And this allows for a lot more freedom in what I can have. I can have stuff like, it could just be as simple as a chair, or it could be like a canister that explodes upon impact. Now then, as for how I would if I was to take on either one of these ideas, or even for my project idea, which was a tower defense slash offense, where players are constantly fighting back and forth over towers. From these examples I've given, probably the most I would have talked is probably the RPG system that Anthem had, due to it just being very unique in the fact that you can choose different abilities, as well as build into different stats to accompany those and benefit those abilities. Another one I would also really like to go for is the huge destruction that Battlefield has, because it allows for way more interesting design in terms of levels, as players can now make their own pathways through levels, and it creates a brand new interesting dynamic. Thank you for watching.